guys doing the recording okay if we start? Right. Very good. Okay. My name is Owen Atkin. I'm the Director of the Centre for Entrepreneurial Agri-Technology, mouthful, CEAT as we call it. So thank you everyone for coming today for this panel discussion around the future of the ag innovation ecosystem. In a moment I'll pass over to Mark Kenny, who will be our MC. I just wanted to firstly thank our panel members for making the time, and also for Mark for giving his time to MC the event, and also for our audience that will be here and can ask some questions a bit later. I just wanted to introduce firstly CEAT. CEAT is an entity which came out of a collaboration between ANU and CSIRO. Started back in 2018 with investment from the ACT government, and it was elevated to an ANU Innovation Institute a couple of years ago. That gives us a sort of a mandate really for working across colleges, across disciplines at the university to tackle complex challenges. And in our space, they are complex challenges in the agricultural sector. So each year we have a strategic planning process, and that is helping refine where should we invest our time and resources in the coming year. But also this year is important because we're transitioning to a second stage of an innovation institute. We need to work out what our boundaries are. And so an event like this helps us define what are some of those complex issues that are facing the agricultural sector, and where could the university, and in its collaboration with CSIRO, help address some of those challenges. So the event's important strategically for us. My own feeling is that this sort of discussion is also really important for the nation. We've put intergenerational challenges in your sort of task today in terms of what we're asking you to think about. And the reason for that is that much of the investment portfolio or investment portfolios and so on of the country is really focused around near and medium term challenges. I'd argue that we don't necessarily have the ecosystem that's actually fit for purpose for dealing with challenges that might be 10, 20 or 30 years in terms of the nature of that challenge and their complexity. So I'll be interested to hear what others on the panel here think about in terms of what the nature of those challenges are and whether we have what would success look like, you know, in terms of us setting up an innovation ecosystem to address those challenges. So fascinating to see where the panel takes this. You're all confident in your opinions. You all come from slightly different areas, and so I'm looking forward to a lively conversation. Now, a big thank you and shout out to the CEAT team who've put this together. Particularly Pip today and Meredith and others for arranging the room into such a lovely space. This used to be the Research School of Chemistry. It was recently gutted and is now becoming something about the College of Engineering and Computer Science will inhabit, and so it's a great space for us to be able to use today. So on that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Professor Owen Atkin, and for those very kind comments. Hello and welcome to this special panel discussion on the future of agricultural innovation. And I say that very much as a city boy, someone who has a different relationship with agricultural industries from perhaps many of the people in this room. I hope that doesn't show too much. The other thing I'm hoping doesn't show too much is my legs, because Morris Riley at the Press Club, whenever I've been chairing the Press Club luncheons, he's the CEO, and he would sometimes, you know, sort of indicate like this to me during an event when he'd realised that, you know, my socks weren't particularly long enough to cover my legs, and this was not good for TV. And I noticed there's a camera there and a pretty bright light, so apologies for that. As you know, I'm Mark Kenny. I'm a full-time academic employee of ANU these days, specifically the Australian Studies Institute, and I'm also connected to the School of Politics and International Relations. And you may also have heard my podcast, Democracy Sausage, which we put out each week, in which we try and cover events in politics, sometimes driven by the news cycle, other times driven by bigger issues. The last couple have obviously been on Ukraine. Very hard not to do that, but we'll also look at some other issues. So if I can put in a plug for that at this stage, I'll cheekily do so. Can I first acknowledge the land on which we meet? This is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, which was never ceded. And can I pay my respects to First Nations peoples, and particularly to their elders past and present. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing in all of human history. Now, By way of structure today, what we're going to do is we're going to allow each of the panel members to give us a brief sort of précis of their particular perspective on the subject matter before us. Then that should take probably, we'll say 5 or 6 minutes each. I know this can be quite elastic. I'll try and police it, but I'll ask you to be disciplined in that if you can. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion, and I would encourage members of the audience throughout those 2 stages to be thinking about any questions that you might want to bring up to the panel after that, because there then will be a period of questions from the audience. And when you're doing so, there will be a roving mic, I think the one that Owen just had. Is there a stand? Is that what you're pointing to? Oh, right, okay. And that mic will come to you, and if you could just indicate who you are. This event is being recorded, which you should know also. So if you could just say who you are and your organisation, and then we'll take it from there. So if I can begin by going to Christine Mulhearn. Would you like to? I might just say a couple of things about you as far as I know, and you can then take it up from there. Christine is Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, Water and Environment in the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, and I understand that you have a particular perspective on this, so I'll hand it over to you now, Christine, and then we'll move on after that.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So I want to talk a little bit about supply chains, because I thought that was kind of a topical thing. And if you think about what the pandemic has shown us, it's that there are shocks to the system that occur. And most developed countries have suddenly had this new shock. We're used to being able to go and buy things. You go to your local produce area, you pick what you want, when you want and how you want, in the size you want, the shape you want, and the availability you want. And so this is happening in a lot of developed countries, that this is changing. You can't suddenly go to the supermarket and pick up everything you want, and that becomes really quite confronting for people. It's something that starts to challenge, and if you think about, go back to my old university days, we talk about Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, it becomes a need. I need this thing. Well, do you need it or do you want it? So if you go to the supermarket and you really, really want cauliflower to make cauliflower rice this week, and you can't get it and you can only get the frozen kind, that's actually challenging a want, not a need. But as humans, we see it as a need. That's what we think about. Because in developed countries, we're really quite used to this. So the supply chain is absolutely under pressure, but is it under pressure because of the things we think they are? Is it just that, human psychology, personal behaviours, we still see empty shelves and panic buying, or is it something different? The supply chain in most developed countries is actually quite complicated. It's an interdependent system. The inputs that come in and the inputs that go out involve materials, a chain, the systems. Recently, we've seen that there was a lack of chicken meat. The answer was there was actually quite a lot of chicken, but it was mainly packaged up and processed for restaurants. And it's not easy to turn that around into the packaging that someone can go and buy at the supermarket in the nice little box that you're used to that scans beautifully at the checkout and means it flows through. So is food security a thing, or is it just around how we're used to seeing things, and are we challenging ourselves? If you think about domestic consumption in Australia, we grow about 85 to 90% of the goods that we produce here. We're quite lucky compared to most international countries. And the 10 to 15% that's different is what I call discretionary. We like French champagne. We like really good chocolate from Belgium. We like certain things. Doesn't mean you can't get quite good, beautiful Tasmanian sparklings, and I'm a huge supporter of Hague's, but it's a choice. I would like some beautiful Belgian chocolate. I would like to gift a French champagne. It's a like over a need. So when we think about it, other countries are in different spaces. So when we panic buy and we do all sorts of things, what does that mean for others? What is that signal that it sends? Does it send a signal that says Australian produce isn't reliable? The products you buy here won't be available in your time of need. We're an exporting nation. We grow a huge amount of food, we produce different types of food, we now add on, but we export quite a lot of it. And we can export billions of dollars worth of food because as much as I personally try to consume as much every day, we're never going to, as a nation, eat everything we can produce here. It's just not happening. So how do we position ourselves and what does it look like? If you think about it, and I look at a country like Singapore, completely different to Australia. Prior to the global pandemic, Singapore grew about 0.5% of their food. Their current goal by 2030 is to actually grow 30%. If you've ever been to Singapore, there's not a lot of land left. So how are they doing it? They're looking at things like growing vegetables on rooftops. Every public housing building will now have an urban farm. How do you do it, and what does that look like? And if you're immediately thinking about it from Australian context, you're like, well, wow, that's 30% that we can no longer sell them. And to put it in context, we send about $2.1 billion of food to Singapore, and we're number 9 on their import list. So we've suddenly lost 30% of that market. And my question to us all is that a loss? Or is that actually an opportunity? Can we suddenly go and have a conversation about a services industry? When I started out my career a very long time ago, I worked in mining. And I was a welder, and you don't see old welders. It's not good for our knees. But most of my friends who are still in that business now don't mine here. They mine overseas. They sell their services. They sell their know-how. They sell their knowledge and their way of doing things. We don't really have an agricultural sector that is about know-how. We sell the good. We don't sell ourselves. So does something like food security and supply chains and this new nationalism that people are talking about open up a really amazing opportunity for Australian agriculture to sell not just what we produce, but who we are and our way of doing it? And if you think about it, that $2.1 billion could grow somewhere to around 4.5 if we suddenly move ourselves not only from number 9 further up the list in terms of goods, but also become a major services provider. We have great aquaculture here in Australia. We're good at growing different types of produce. Well, Singapore's an island, just like us. Urban farming is something that we don't do a lot of here, but it's becoming more and more common. Just down the road here at ANU, there's the Braddon Urban Farm. It produces a huge amount of produce for people. So how do we support it? How do we look at things like protected cropping, which we do extensively in places like Tasmania, and say to Singapore, well, here's what we can sell to you. Here's the technology we can do it with. Here's the things that we can help you change your cycles. So for me, what you look at this in terms of is an opportunity. Yes, we do have some supply chain challenges. Yes, I'd like to be able to go to the supermarket and get everything I want. But can I turn that negative into a positive? Can I make it a way to say, yes, we do these things here, but we can do them in totally different ways? The last thing I'll leave people with is a conversation that I've talked about a lot, and so some people may have heard this story, but it's about pineapples. So in Australia, we eat a lot of pineapples. Not as many as you might think, but we grow the same kind of varietals that we've grown for a really long time. In Costa Rica, they grow bright pink pineapples. I mean like highlighter pink pineapples. And they're really expensive. They're mainly used for ceremonies, for functions, and they're about $150 US a pineapple. I'm pretty sure no one here went to the supermarket and bought themselves a $150 pineapple in the last couple of weeks. And they import those mainly into Asian markets. So why aren't we growing pink pineapples? What's stopping us from changing our mindset to say, this would be a great thing for us to do? We grow pineapples in northern Queensland, the NT, close to Asia. What are we thinking about to change that mindset of our producers? How are we supporting them with different programs? How are we making the technology support them? Because it is pretty different growing conditions in Costa Rica to here. But the interest is still the same. So what are we doing as an ecosystem in agriculture to make everyone think just that little bit differently?
Thank you very much. Very much to think about there, and will certainly prompt a number of questions, I'm sure. Next speaker is Pip Grant, Senior Manager of evokeAg. Now, Pip is a community engagement specialist with a focus on innovation systems and global collaboration. And I understand, Pip, you work largely with startups. So if you could introduce yourself and frame your perspective on this challenge.
Thanks, Mark. And so I work at Agrifutures Australia, which is one of the 15 research and development corporations that represent our industries across agriculture, forestries and fisheries in Australia. And so carrying on from Christine's theme of global supply chains, when I think about the future of ag innovation, I think about how are we supporting our farmers in showing up in global markets with all of the changes, whether it's more resilient supply chains, whether it is actually being able to maintain premium prices and market access as everyone becomes choosier and more conscious of their choices of food and the provenance and sustainability that they're seeing. And I think, how do we bring together a global ag innovation community that puts the farmer at the centre of this problem solving? And so I'll probably speak around how do we take a global lens to local problems, but how do we also learn from our local innovators that are exporting a heap of their IP and technology to the world, and how do we connect that all back to farmers? And so when I think of the ag innovation system, I think of our farmers in the middle, and then we've got our wonderful academics, innovators, researchers, scientists, tech developers, such as the team here at ANU and CAT. And then I think, well, we've got our government departments that are funding a lot of this and making sure that there's industry focus, that there's always something driving momentum forward so that we can always maintain our exports. And then we've got our corporates, and our corporate innovators are wonderful innovators. Often it's a very specific or shared vision driven at an executive level that's, to suit a strategic plan in a specific industry. And then we've got our entrepreneurs, so those people that can really think about how we're taking that technology, that science, and think, well, how do we make sure that all of our farmers or all of the logistics or our retailers along the supply chain have access to that new technology or science? And then we've got our risk capital, so that's all of the money that's invested, whether it's from private enterprise, from government, from our VC community, or from corporates that are willing to take a chance on new innovation to make sure that our farmers always have access to the latest in global innovation. And so that's homegrown and, learning from our peers that have got shared characteristics in other markets that we can bring back to our Australian farmers. And so I think we're on a really exciting precipice when it comes to ag innovation. And over the last 5 years, there's been just wonderful movement in an ag innovation community coming together. And I think, everyone in this room is working across ag innovation. And I think that they can see the enormous shifts, whether it is our startup culture blossoming, and now we get to spend half of our time now talking about scale-ups that are in 8 countries and, getting hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. Now we get to talk about our IP that's leading the world, that's coming out of Australian universities. And we get to talk about commercialisation as a realistic pathway where we're seeing our universities, our innovator community working together hand in hand with our risk capital, entrepreneurs and corporates to actually think, well, this is the problem and this is going to be the most effective way to deliver a solution back to the end user. And so when you think about, how you tie that all together, it's almost as complex as the global supply chain itself, because all of those people are coming together to actually, really focus on certain aspects of the supply chain. And I think with a lot of the strategies that have been quite collaborative across, whether it's government, our, people like ANU, and I'll use CAT as an example. After talking to Owen this morning, they're a fabulous example of a multidisciplinary sort of hub that's bringing all of those skills that are going to be needed to make our farmers prosperous into the future. And I think when I think about the future of ag innovation, it's multidisciplinary, it's across supply chains, it's digital, it's sustainable, and it's always putting our farmer at the centre of the problem. It's very rare that you'll solve something so far up the supply chain that doesn't mean a farmer is putting something into an app on farm, or that there's something that, a seed company needs to do even before it gets to farm. And so I think in terms of where our next steps are in ag innovation, I think there is going to be, and I think everyone would have heard the word commercialisation happening more and more, but how do we actually bring all of those different players together in a way that's effective? And that in itself can be an enormous challenge. And at Agrifutures Australia, we set up a platform called evokeAg this year, which is a partnership with the Department of Ag and all of the 15 RDCs, so that we can actually start showcasing all of the research that we're currently investing in on one platform. And so in less than a year, we've got over 2,500 projects that are related directly to agriculture, forestry or fisheries. And so everybody else can see what we're working on now too, including our corporate partners that will be able to come and say, well, I didn't know that you were doing so much in, our fermentation, so that we're making our plant-based proteins taste better, and so that we can actually increase our rotational crops. Or we didn't know that you were doing so much in biosecurity. That's so fabulous that you're taking all the lessons that you're learning from defence and actually applying them into, keeping our borders protected from the things that could decimate our large commodity crops. And, you know, through just that information sharing, there's been hundreds, almost 1,000 inquiries made just from people who are just sitting outside of our research and development corporations wanting to do business with us and our research partners. And I think if we can keep going along that trajectory and bringing in more partners from our corporates, you know, if you wanted to market strategy, a multinational corporation is a fabulous way to go in terms of reach. But if you want to grow our startups and our scale-ups, bringing in those people with those brilliant ideas or that fabulous wealth of experience that might have been scaling technologies in a gaming market or in defence for the last 30 years, how wonderful to bring in their skills and experience for our farmers to be the key beneficiary. And so I don't like to use the word collaboration too much because I know it's been a buzzword and overused, but the future of ag innovation is through collaborative research and investment.
Thanks very much, Pip. I have a vision in my mind of some spotty kid who's an expert at gaming trying to explain whole new systems to a farmer who's perhaps not familiar with it. But I'm sure there are all kinds of ways around those kinds of incompatibilities, and we'll draw them out as we go. Dave Moore is our next speaker. Dave's an agribusiness professional, former managing director, general manager, as I understand. Yeah, got to get it right, from Australian Horticultural Innovation. And you've had experience in finalising commodity trade agreements in China and places like that, strategic policy and those sorts of spheres. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, we good to go?
Yeah, we're good.
Joseph Schumpeter, the father of innovation, said there is nothing so treacherous as the obvious. And I sit here and it's difficult to focus on the micro issues, we all know them, when there is no functional macro framework. And I think the Japanese encephalitis issue highlighted that. My hypothesis is that there is no agri-innovation system in Australia. There is self-interest, contradiction, confusion, some good intention, a number of orphan reviews, unconnected initiatives and division. There's an outdated hub and spoke model, largely unchanged since the 1990s. This RDC gate is where potential investment partners are directed to enter and where the innovation agenda gets overrun by the long tail of agriculture and who effectively drive the innovation implementation agenda in this country. To effect change, you need access to financial critical mass. And what I like to do to understand an industry or an issue, you've got to map the money trail. So if you map the money trail in this country, there are only two broad buckets of funds. There's a grower research levy and the matching taxpayer subsidy, a number of other government appropriations as well, and there are commercial for-profit funds. The focus is sadly on control rather than the outcome. The first bucket of funds, once matched, the grower levy becomes Commonwealth funds. The Commonwealth, through the RDCs, abdicate the decision-making to the least centralised group, way down past the board and management level, placing control closest to the constituency, or what I call the long tail of agriculture. A bottom-up command and control style from the constituency then embeds self-interest, unconscious bias or conscious bias that undermine effective collaboration, adding significant transactional cost under the guise of wide transparency and consultation. The Commonwealth, through the RDC model, are far too concerned with appeasing the long tail of agriculture rather than the early adopters who inhabit the bottom. The long tail of agriculture inhabit the bottom half of the adoption curve. Their focus is on the short term, and not surprisingly, it's mirrored in the investment decisions. Then there is a conditioning effect where a passive defensive research community just accept this as business as usual and modify their strategies to suit. The number of industry and peak body stage gates created discourage innovation outside this funnel. So we have an immature domestic ag venture capital market. We have an ag tech bubble that doesn't understand absorptive capacity. And we've seen real cross-sectoral and transformational research go unaddressed. I've got a fact check for you. A cursory look at the investment portfolios of the RDCs, the ones you can see online, you'll see that 75 to 80% of the investments are applied or maintenance in nature. And 80% of all those investments cluster under $500,000. So what are the big productivity issues that are being addressed, and why are they so unbalanced? The constituency sees the risk of diverting funds away from maintenance and applied industry research is too great. The second bucket, they just view the first bucket as too awkward and problematic to engage with. So they just do what they always do. They let the profit motive drive innovation. They pick investment winners, invest strategically where the greatest returns are. Think about the most widely adopted agricultural technologies in the last 40 years. Where did they originate, and what is the common theme across all of them? A lingering timidity and passiveness at the RDC board and Commonwealth level view risk as something negative. And negative commentary from constituents is to be avoided at all costs. A focus on transactional compliance seeks to limit any negative reaction, further limiting any opportunity for change. So I'm sorry, but I believe change will not come from the Commonwealth or the RDCs. There is no real top-down direction or courage to challenge the status quo and those who benefit from it. There is an opportunity though, folks. There is an opportunity for like-minded research organisations to build outwardly focused, mission-driven commercial partnerships to solve the more intractable problems through more open sourcing of research winners. Not losers, but winners. These like-minded organisations need to become hybrids. And by hybrids, I mean they need to become both providers of research and funders of research. And I know that's really challenging for some folks. But they need to work together outside the current arrangement to drive innovation to openly source research winners, a characteristic of the best global innovation systems in the world. They need to partner with the best in class, either domestically or internationally, seek new technology platforms and build more impactful partnerships. You know when you'll have it right, folks. That's when the RDCs ring you up and they want to fund you. Trust me, that's the logical way it works. The challenge I put to you is, are you brave enough to move to this hybrid position away from the honeypot and put aside your respective sovereignty for the obvious greater good?
Well, that was particularly challenging, and I'm very interested.
I said to be provocative.
No, I'm not criticising any of it. I have to say, as someone who's covered politics for a long time, many of those things ring instinctively true with me in terms of the timidity of government and institutions. So I'll be interested to see how we proceed with that debate and if there are any alternative perspectives that people would like to put forward. The next speaker is Tracy Martin. Now, Tracey is the CEO of the Australian Agritech Association, or AAA. Now, I assume, Tracey, it was named like that back in the days of the phone directory to get it right on the front page. That shows how old I am, I suppose. Phone directories, who talks about them anymore? Yes, sorry. Tracey is as I say, the CEO of that organisation, and that supports a sector, a world-class sector, really, of $100 billion national target for agriculture and development. So over to you, Tracey.
Thank you very much. I'm the CEO of the association. It's an association that represents Australian agri-tech companies. We're obviously member-led, we rely on membership funds, and we're about 2 years old, but in terms of really, I guess, turning on the tap and becoming really active is probably about January this year. We've been building quite a strong membership base over the last year, but in terms of really being able to service those members, it's just been in the last couple of months. We've recently had an Agritech summit where we talked about some of the really challenging issues in the ecosystem. In that forum, we included a number of key investors in the Agritech companies or Agritech ecosystem, which we call it. We sort of seem to be talking about two different, sort of not different ecosystems, but some people refer to it as the Agritech ecosystem. That's certainly what my membership calls it, but also an ag innovation ecosystem. So that was a really important event for us to start to draw out some of the key issues which are sometimes talked about in cupboards within the Agritech ecosystem. And I guess here today on this panel, we don't have someone from the investor side, but certainly, and as Dave mentioned, investment in the Agritech sector and also ag innovation is really quite in its infancy in Australia, and that is a key issue. I've spent most of February preparing an election statement, which we've shared publicly. So I'll just take you through very, very quickly what was in that statement. And I think it's helpful in terms of us as a association representing mostly commercial agritech companies from startup through to scale up and very large agritech companies, just to let you know what are the things we teased out as being important. We did identify that we think a number of the productivity targets that are currently in place across a number of agricultural industries, which have targets by 2030, are at risk if there isn't some adjustment to the ecosystem and some of the realignment that Dave's quite helpfully articulated for me. I'm not sure that was a copy of my notes or something, but certainly we think there's a number of things that need to happen at the government level, but then also there needs to be some really strong groundwork done to give the ecosystem, I guess, a baseline understanding of the work that we need to do going forward. I'll come back to this first one in a moment. We believe that the agritech sector, and we're talking about it as an agritech sector because we think we need to think about it as a tech sector. It has very, very important and fundamental connections with agriculture and the other stakeholders which have been talked about here today, but we need to understand that it also operates within technology. And you have all the challenges there of skills base, having the necessarily skills in Australia to grow that ecosystem. You have the requirements for international collaboration from very large technology companies, which we absolutely need. And you also have, I guess, the unique skill sets that you need to run technology businesses. So we think we need to treat it as a tech sector, and the tech sectors have their own unique challenges, and they need to be incorporated into the ecosystem and the way that we're going to build this ecosystem moving forward. We also need a coherent national strategy, and some of our other panellists have also talked about perhaps we need a national strategy as well to grow the sector, and that is with that lens of technology over the top of it. We're talking a lot about a cross-departmental approach. Agritech companies and ag innovation in itself crosses over into energy, water, climate, carbon emissions, sustainability, and I probably missed one, connectivity. Now, that's a lot of portfolios, all right, and that's a lot of different ministers, and that's really hard to coordinate. So we think we need to have a think about how are we going to approach building this ecosystem, and particularly to make sure we cover all those different elements. And it might be one of the friction points for not being able to, I guess, move forward. We do feel that we're in a stage where we need to accelerate the ecosystem to address the climate and sustainability challenges, but also to meet our productivity targets and then some of the changes in the supply chain and our overseas exporting challenges that we've got at the moment. We also think the commercial industry needs a little bit to be more involved in the direct investment approach into the agri-tech sector, so to consult with industry more about how that's happening. That includes some of the systems and institutions that Dave talked about as well. There's a number of initiatives that we've suggested, which are industry projects that we need. It was stated at the National Agritech Summit a couple of weeks ago that there really is very little understanding about the size of the agritech sector here in Australia, its capital raises, how many people they employ, its contribution to the economy, and then its flow-on effects to the economy in terms of creating new industries, logistics, transport, as it raises productivity, and changing the workforce in rural and regional Australia and digitalisation. That work just hasn't been done, but we're still seeing a lot of investment into various initiatives, but we really don't have a baseline. So we think that work is overdue, and we're offering to do that work. We also think there needs to be a blueprint for the oversight of the development of Agritech as a sector. So we think across those various departments, we would like the commercial industry to be able to work with government about how we're going to coordinate. And obviously other stakeholders need to be involved in that, but we don't want to operate in silos. And certainly commercial companies and companies bootstrapping really can't afford to do that. There needs to be an Agritech sector roadmap. So once we have a baseline, we need to work out how to develop and scale and accelerate the industry. And also the tech sectors don't operate in isolation. Any ag innovation really can't operate without international participants from the tech sectors overseas. So there needs to be an international dimension as well to our work. And certainly a lot more work around adoption, but also focusing a little bit on the Agritech side of that in terms of getting, if you're talking to a tech sector, making sure that they're ready to operate in the agricultural space. We were asked to talk a little bit about intergenerational issues, and obviously the tech sector is traditionally or has a much younger perspective around it, but certainly the advice that I have received and when people talk through their company successes and what really works for them is that and particularly in agriculture, but also in being able to commercialise, is intergenerational weaving. So you have your really brilliant computer scientists and your innovators, but you need to combine them with your really seasoned, experienced business people who know the capital markets, knows how to raise funds, know how to commercialise, know how to navigate organisations like the ANU, and to be able to really leverage that for the organisation. So from an intergenerational point of view, I think from an agri-tech sector commercialisation point of view, it's really intergenerational weaving is really important. From an agricultural point of view, I think on-farm intergenerational weaving is really important in terms of including the younger people in the decision-making on the farm as well. So you sort of bring the changes through and the technology changes through as well. But, you know, overall, from all of those, I do think that the acknowledging that the cross-departmental approach needs to happen and we need a national strategy. I think that's probably the most important, and from there we can build out the other things that we need. One other thing that I'm seeing, I just throw this out there to be a little bit controversial. Anyone who sits on, you probably do, Dave, based on your talk, sits on channels around Tech Nation or Startup Nation, or is watching what Singapore's doing. If you're on the DFAT channels or other embassies around the world, so the UK Foreign Office strategy, you will start to see very, very strong national strategies around developing global expertise and a global and a sort of a national strategy around developing global strength in technology. And a large part of it at the moment, it's probably since the end of last year, is agriculture, it's sustainability, it's clean tech and it's climate tech. So there is a lot of work and a lot of heavy lifting being done by other countries, and I can see it being rolled out in their diplomatic footprint across the globe. And I don't see us doing that at the moment, and I just think that's worth thinking about.
It's quite fascinating to think that, because one of the questions that was sort of coming to me as you spoke was, why don't we have that roadmap already? It seems so obvious, and also to hear that international dimension and to hear that other countries some other countries are moving ahead more purposefully in that regard. So we'll no doubt draw that out. Next speaker is Richard Dickman, who is Principal Consultant at Apical Advisory. I'm not sure if that's right, the pronunciation. It is? Really?
Yes.
Oh, amazing.
Excellent.
And also Director of Grains Research and Development Corporation, formerly from Bayer. You've got a wealth of experience in this sector, particularly interested in issues of sustainability, which of course is a theme that everyone needs to think about. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Mark. So yes, you've let the cat out of the bag. I'm on one of those spineless boards that Dave mentioned. So we can debate that in a bit, Dave. Look, sitting here within CEAT, I wanted to go and make a few comments around commercialisation. I think it's kind of accepted wisdom that Australia has an effective innovation system, but we fall down when it comes to commercialisation. And my experience over the years with Bayer, dealing with a lot of R&D bodies, I'd have to confirm that often commercialisation is kind of poorly understood and not given a lot of focus, certainly early enough. So I just, again, based on my kind of experience within Bayer, to kind of set out some of the issues around commercialisation. First of all, it's difficult and long. Often it's not really appreciated. Like, for example, within Bayer, like for every $1 we'd spend in innovation, there'd be $5 to $10 spent in commercialisation or development of a product. What it means is that you take an ag technology, you need to test it in basically every environment you're going to sell it in. You need to characterise it. You need to be able to explain it very carefully, and it has to work 99% of the time. Anything more than 1% failure will bankrupt a company in the end. So it has to be tested everywhere. You have to, obviously also many of these technologies require regulatory activities. That has to be done in every country. So it ends up being very, very expensive and takes a significant amount of time. The second thing about commercialisation is you need to get to scale as rapidly as possible. A lot of the failures of our commercialisation, the efforts in the past, I think we focused on Australia and then decided to go overseas. That's years wasted. You need to get to the big markets as quickly as possible to build scale, to build experience, and to, if not dominate, at least be a major player in global markets. And based on those 2 points, you more often than not, you need a commercial partner to work with. And there Australia has a couple of challenges. First of all, we really don't have many domestic commercial players you can actually work with that can actually take your products to global markets. The one good example is New Farm. I mean, they have done some good work globally, but it would not be considered, as a major ag tech player on the global scale. The second thing is that the global ag tech industry over the last 10 years has restructured significantly. There was a lot of mergers and reorganisation of technologies. And my view is that it has actually really focused most of those companies on the major markets of the world, which are the Americas and which are Europe. For example, in Bayer, when I left, 45% of the turnover was done in one country, the US. 25% was done in Latin America, another 20% was done in Europe. So that left 10% for the rest of the world combined, including India and China. So you can well imagine, there's not a lot of executives in these companies worrying about whether they've invested in Australia or not. So, and the other thing that goes with that reorganisation is the focus is very much on the crops that are really important there, which is corn, soybean, cotton. Wheat is an important crop globally, but, it's well down the list in terms of dollars spent in innovation. So, it presents us with some significant challenges if we want to develop our technologies globally and partner and so on. It's a challenge, but it's not insoluble. I think, first of all, as a nation, and this came out in the EY report released 2 or 3 years ago, we really need to focus on what are our core strengths in R&D. What are we going to be really good at? Israel's good at innovation. The Dutch are good at glass houses. What are we good? What are we going to lead the world in? we then need to reflect on how that positioning relates to those global crops and how we can work, with those companies and use that technology with those global crops. For example, we've got no shortage of dry land country here. Drought, heat, that sort of thing. Maybe we're going to be the experts in that. How does that relate to corn, to cotton, to soybean, and how can we partner with those companies on those focused areas? And then we need to go to those companies and really, and they're not all the same. They all have different kind of focus. Figure out which one you can work with, build a relationship, and try to enter into kind of long-term partnerships so that we're not going to dominate the world with these technologies, but we can be a partner in the development or as things go forward. So if we can do that, then we can simultaneously get strong commercialisation of our technology, plus solve our own local activity, our local issues. That would be it, I would say. The other thing that comes with that, one of the big issues is, of course, IP. You need very flexible IP policies. Obviously, you need to defend what you create and define it, but it can't be so tight that you can't even talk to people. And a lot of that comes with, it's much easier if you have long-term relationships with these companies that you can actually trust to have discussions with them, and they're not going to, go steal a kitchen sink sort of thing. So I'll leave it at that. Just sort of some global perspectives on how to commercialise technology that we have to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And there's obviously some terrific complexities there involved in all of this, which are sort of geographical and economic and commercial, and it's clearly, I think you've set out very well there, some of the sort of realities that the sector faces. Finally, let us go to my ANU colleague, relatively newly an ANU colleague in the sense that I just met her at this very event, Associate Professor Johanna Weaver, who is Director of the newly formed Technology or Tech Policy Design Centre. So perhaps you can explain, Johanna, what that is and your role in it, and I'll hand over to you to make some comments.
Thank you so much. So full disclosure, I'm not a city girl. I grew up in country Western Australia and in a little town called Manjimup, which absolutely is an agricultural centre of the world. But I have not focused or dealt with agriculture in a professional capacity for a long time. And I think the conversation or the comment that Tracy made about this being a technology industry is a point that I'd like to particularly draw out. So at the Tech Policy Design Centre, we're looking at the way that technology policy is shaping the worlds that we live in. And policy is a word that people often roll their eyes at when they hear it. When I say policy, I mean everything broad as regulation, legislation, strategy and policy documents, so quite a broad approach. And the example that I normally give to highlight why technology policy is important is around facial recognition. And I'll give that example, but then I'll give some ag-specific ones as well. So with facial recognition technology, we have a lot of the same technologies in Australia as they have in China. When that technology is rolled out, the impact of that technology and whether that technology is shaping a world that we all want to live in, or that is more shaping a world that is lending towards dystopian fiction, is actually the policy. So the privacy protections, the security and the safety provisions that we put around the technology is what makes a big difference in terms of shaping it. And I think as we're talking about the agritech as an industry, we need to be thinking about all of the different ways that technology policy is shaping it as an industry, and really focusing on how can we use agritech to shape a future for the Australian agriculture industry and for our farmers, to create a future that is a future that we all want for the farmers, but also for Australia. The other point that I think is useful to draw out is when we use the word regulation, very often people hear red tape, and that's absolutely not correct. When we get regulation and policy and strategy right, it's enabling. So, Owen, you asked at the start, what does success look like in this environment? And I think success for Australia in the agritech industry means that Australia is actually recognised as a world leader, perhaps in some specific sectors. that we have regulation and policy that drives and fosters innovation. And again, I think there's some suggestions on the table about how we can create and modify the current system. But that we also have safety and security when we use that technology for the farmers that are using it, for the food that we eat, and for the fibres that we're wearing. And so there's a broad ecosystem that sits around that, all of which is driving economic growth. So my key message for people when you think about the tech policy that accompanied companies, the Agritech that we're talking about today, is to think about the way that that Agritech sits into the broader ecosystem. So another way to think about it is to say, when you're looking at this really innovative new piece of technology, yes, we absolutely have to focus on the opportunity and how that is going to help our farmers and deliver better productivity. But we should also at the same time be thinking about the way that technology could potentially be misused or used in a way that is different to its intended consequence. And how will that impact on the broader ecosystem? And what policies can we put in place either to encourage it if it's something good or to protect against it? And so that simple thing of thinking about how could this technology be misused or used in a way beyond the sort of narrow lens of the initial exciting innovative process is something that we haven't done a lot in the tech space, and we need to do more to protect and ensure that we're promoting those intergenerational benefits and impacts. So just a few examples of this, as we have technology that is giving us huge amounts of information around soil quality or farming patterns, how is this impacting on insurance prices or land valuations? Are we okay with that information that we're gaining from that technology being used to inform insurance policies? We might be. We might be happy that the price of our land is increasing because we've got great soil, but likewise, you might not be. And so by asking that question, you start to focus on, okay, are there some protections as we're developing and implementing these technologies that we should be rolling out at the same time? And that foresight in looking at it will have a big impact on the way that these technologies impact in future generations. I think another point that has come out for me just in a very early side conversation that Richard and I had is, to the extent that Australia is a taker of technology, of Agritech at the moment, we also need to think about the policies that are built in around the technology that we're importing and using. Do those policies actually align with the values in Australia? And do they actually represent the best interests of Australian farmers? Because if we are takers of technology, we're also takers of technology policy. And as I said at the start, that technology policy is what is shaping, in a large part, the future for Australian farmers in the agritech environment. So huge opportunities, and many of my colleagues have touched on this in more detail, but in terms of climate change, in terms of productivity, in terms of developing agritech as a service for Australia. But if we also at the same time are focusing on that potential for it to be misused, and not because we want to focus on the negative, but because we want to enhance and embrace and force multiply the positive as we go through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had 6 speakers and I think covered a lot of ground here. There is some overlaps in a number of things that have been said and probably some differences as well. And I'm very happy to entertain a discussion here now where perhaps you may have observations about what each other have had to say, which I think is going to be very useful for us in kind of forming this into an understandable discussion, really. We've heard difficulties with getting innovation up. We've heard difficulties in financing it. We've heard references to regulation and so forth. I wonder if I could just ask you each to encapsulate what you think. I mean, Tracy's point about there being an agricultural tech sector, an ag tech sector, and you made the point, Tracy, that you like to think of it, it needs to be thought of in those terms. Does everyone accept that as a is there any difference to accepting that it is a sector in its own right?
I think it's a very altruistic goal, and yeah, there's no doubt it's possible. I think the challenge is you look at, the home of Agtech, which is, in my perspective, the US, you have an immense investment by multinational companies in agriculture and medical science and biotechnology, and you get a lot of spillover. All those money spills out the top, and prospectors and entrepreneurs go, well, I can take that and use it over there. And we don't have that spillover effect here. Now, we may, and when people say, well, we want our ag tech sector in Australia to mirror the rest of the world, well, it can't, because just the sheer lack of spillover means that that's not possible.
Are you talking about scale there in terms of the size of our...
Well, spillover drives scale, yeah. So where's all the ag tech coming from in the US? Nobody really sets out a lot of times to develop ag tech. It's a result of a serendipitous finding in some other field of endeavour that's applied to agriculture. And I don't think we have that scale here, but I think in time, I think it's a good goal to aim for.
I'll differ from you there, Dave. I think scale also builds spillover. I mean, I think the thing with having an ag tech industry, it's like having a car industry. You've got the people making the cars, but then you've got a whole bunch of R&D that goes around that. So it creates an overall environment of innovation. Where there's as an ecosystem where people can work in and so on, and a very fertile system. And look, we haven't had that in the past, or very limited. And Tracy, I think where the ag tech innovation startups process has got to in the last 2 to 3 years has been fantastic. And thanks to Agrifutures as well for pushing that along. I think it really has started to take off. I mean, now, it's still. If you look at the numbers globally, it's still obviously very small. But there's hopes there that we can get that kind of a broader ecosystem established. Yeah.
Anyone else have any? Yes.
For me, it's more to answer your question with a question, which is, often when we talk about tech policy, our response is, well, actually, how do you define tech policy? It actually becomes almost everything policy. And I think Nick Davies speaks about this very well. And so my question to Tracy is, when you talk about the agritech sector, is there an agritech sector, or is it just the agricultural sector? Like, does every farmer have a tech aspect to what they're doing these days? And my impression is yes, but it's anecdotal rather than actually based on research. And then is what you're talking about growing the very specific Australian Agritech entrepreneurial network, and that being sort of a subset of it?
At the association, our view is that the agri-tech sector is the application of technology to the agri-food supply chain. So, it's from, pre-farm grade right through to, what ends up on the plate. And it is viewed as a tech sector because it is applying the new technologies which are being developed. So most farmers have an iPhone or a phone and they're using that, or they're using accounting software and stock monitoring software has been around for a while. But the new technologies that we're seeing applied certainly do require quite unique skills, unique companies, unique people to be in them, and then the building out of those technologies through to commercialisation. So that, from our point of view, that's definitely what we think distinguishes it from, your basic accounting packages and monitoring tags, and doing things like blockchain for provenance, and which you can take right through the supply chain. In terms of it being a tech sector and building it, we think that there's a $20 billion opportunity here within Australia, statistically, if we can get adoption and grow our technology. And then we also think overseas there's a $20 billion opportunity as well. Now, when you do the numbers in terms of the international market, so by 2023, I think it's meant to be a $700 billion agri-tech sales industry. So if we're 2% of the international agricultural production, 2% of that is 20 billion. So, from our point of view, in Australia, we've got such a broad, diverse climate in terms of being able to test and develop technology, and we've got such a strong agricultural system here and reputation, and then research and development. We don't see why we couldn't match what we're doing in agriculture with Agritech. And it's arguable that 2%, just aiming for 2% of those international sales is lower, because certainly compared to some of the other large agricultural producing countries, we're far more advanced.
Can I take up that issue about the industry and just ask a sort of a left field question, I suppose, for anyone really? This might be Christine, might be in your wheelhouse, I'm not sure. Thinking about the resources sector, you said you started off in the resources sector indeed. Is there a thing called the resources tech sector? And is the critical difference between, because we know technology is absolutely crucial in the resources sector, it's crucial everywhere, but it's very much part of the economics of it nowadays. I'm wondering whether one of the critical differences there is that the key units of the resources sector are large, well-funded corporations, with a lot of economies of scale and so forth. Is that a critical structural difference that applies there as distinct from agriculture, which is more atomised, I guess, and more geographically diverse as well?
So the structure of agriculture is really interesting. We've got a history around the family farm. We don't have, we talked a little bit about the US and Canada and Europe, and they have the structure of more conglomerates and what I call that big agri-business kind of picture, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the same. And if you think about the resources sector, it still has that. You have the big players, but there's still thousands of little companies that either service the sector or operate or have a gold lease here or do, this tiny investigation there. There's still this kind of dichotomy of, big uber scale and then the small business. And if you think about agriculture in Australia, it's kind of that way as it is anyway. So for me, they're actually almost two halves of the same whole. If I think about technology in resources, yes, there's a huge amount, but to be honest, there's still a guy with a pickaxe sometimes going, let's just see what this does. I still do that. People still do that.
Yeah, but that guy's costs his overheads aren't very high, presumably.
Well, depending on where you're trying to get in WA, possibly. But the same if you look at technology and agri-tech and what that looks like in agriculture, someone's still growing something. Someone's still got to produce a pear or, a sheep or whatever. They're still producing a thing. It still has a limited number of inputs to get you to that point. So what we're talking about is that enhancement. How do we actually produce the right thing at the right time with the right conditions to get the highest possible price? Because to be really blunt with everyone, Australia is not a cheap market. The things we grow are going to be expensive. We are a premium market. We have to convince someone that they want to pay notionally more for our good. So what is our price point are we selling it on? And then how do we use things like technology? And technology can be something from, a biosecurity method to go, actually, we're going to check how something works and we're going to provide it safe and clean and green and we didn't put this chemical on or we did in this way, to a market that wants to pay for it. How are we going to assure ourselves? And Tracy brought up that my favourite word is provenance. I'm a big fan of provenance because that proves to the consumer why they want to buy our thing. It's great to work in agriculture, but I work in agriculture to sell it to someone. I don't grow things or produce things in agriculture just for the fun of it. It's still a business. So for me, it's always having that lens of whatever we do, whether that's building Agritech, whether that's producing something, whether that's how we do things, is who's going to buy it and why? Are they going to pay the right price for it?
Another aspect, and Richard talked about this a bit, the take-up, I suppose, of technology, is the ag sector, this might be a kind of a courageous question for me to ask, but is the ag sector instinctively conservative as its voting patterns would seem to suggest? I suppose I'm talking about politically conservative when I talk about voting patterns, but I'm thinking more in terms of as you say, that sort of old model of agriculture. It's an industry which is a sort of coming together of the oldest activities of organised humanity, agriculture, with new technology and with on-costs associated with other capital costs to begin with. I wonder, Pip, whether you think there's a sort of a cultural divide here, that the ag sector lives in permanent tension with its own customers.
I would say yes and no. So when we define sort of an agri-tech industry, and we do spend a lot of time defining it, but it's actually the people that are generating the innovation that are defining things as fintech, mining tech, space tech. Farmers just call it a tractor, we call it a new seed, we call it more sustainable or drought resistant. It's a farm management app. This is my accounting software. This is my app that turns on my water monitoring system. They don't sit around talking to other farmers talking about, well, gosh, my investment in Agritech has been enormous. So I grew up on a teaching orchard, and so it's very easy for me to say that I think farmers are really entrepreneurial, because in spirit they are, and they are fixers and they are tinkerers. Some of the biggest challenges for farmers with digital innovation is they can't fix it themselves. And so I would say...
Much like presumably a lot of the equipment and
Yeah, what if I don't have a 3D printer but my John Deere header breaks down, and I don't, now I do have to, think about, well, how am I servicing this equipment? And so I would say that farmers are very, very, they've got actually quite a high risk tolerance, because it's their money on the line. They can see the margins and they can see the value, or the maybe pickers that they don't need to get their orchard off. It's amazing how resilient you can see farmers and innovative you can see farmers be when you've got harvest and they're sitting on the bomb app and the rain's rolling in and there's not enough trucks. And so when you're in a regional town during harvest, your group chats will light up, does anyone have a truck? Or does anyone have a driver? I've got a driver, no truck. And you can just see how ingenious some farmers can be. But where I think there is the lag is that technology is moving so quickly, and actually educating farmers about how to, I think, weigh up the risk of bringing new technologies onto farm is where there's probably that lag.
Richard, did you want to comment on that?
I'd concur with Pip. I think actually GRDC has just done a 5-yearly farm practice survey. It's not released yet, so I can't go into detail. But, if you look over the 5 years, like 5-year blocks, there are substantial changes. Farmers adopt technology. Good technology is adopted in Australia, very fast. And
they do actually seem quite pragmatic in that sense, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the advantages of downsides of Australia, we're very exposed to global markets, which means that technologies have to deliver a commercial return to growers, and they will, they'll adopt technologies very quickly if it does deliver a commercial return to them. So, yep.
Just on that, Richard, I think we forget when we talk about particularly ag tech and adoption of ag tech. There's in 1990 a great innovation writer called Cohen coined a phrase, absorptive capacity. Absorptive capacity is something we forget about, and it's not. And so farmers will adopt technology when you demonstrate a real value proposition to them. So if you look at, I'm going to answer a question I asked. I'm going to tell you 4 of the best agricultural technologies that have been released in the last 40 years, and so I'll talk about the release of Roundup and minimum tillage. Sort of GM, cotton, soy and corn. The round cotton harvester, probably that piece of technology that makes the round, that replaced the module builder, has probably been the fastest piece of technology I've ever seen adopted. And the other one would be GPS technology in a tractor cab now. It's already in there. So what's the one common theme across all those 4 technologies? You can go into a farmer's farm and it fits into their existing farming system, and you can demonstrate through a pure substitution effect, you can demonstrate a value proposition. And that farmer will go, well, I did this practice in that paddock, I did that practice in that paddock, and I made more money out of that So of course I'm going to adopt it. I think we over detail it. I was reading something about it from an Agtech founder recently who talked about the sociological issues with farmers adopting technology, about loss of control, and what a load of rubbish. It's about a value proposition. Demonstrate the value proposition. Farmers are no different from any other businessman.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was mention in the discussion about the level of Agtech in Australia, and I suppose a number of you have touched on the size of the sector and the size of the agricultural industry in Australia. And I suppose in terms of the point you made, Richard, about the costs of developing technology and getting it to market are prohibitive, and there's a lot of risk involved in that. So, you know, as someone who's listened occasionally to the Country Hour and, you know, seen Landline from time to time on a Saturday afternoon, I can remember seeing stories years ago about Australia's supposedly outstanding prowess in dryland farming, for example, and how we were exporting that technology to other places in the world, very arid places, obviously, sometimes as a service rather, you know, not actually charging for it. But has Australia's position as an ag tech sector, as an ag tech country, gone backwards since then, or
I'll have a go, and maybe somebody else can chime in. Look, I think, we've continued to advance, but certainly other, you know, like the production in the States is much faster. The growth is much greater, you know, based on much higher levels of investment. So, and you know, our competitive position in the world, you know, we have to be very careful about how we are relative to some of the other major markets in the world. I mean, in the last 20 years, the Americas have just absolutely exploded. They are now the breadbasket of the world, whereas our production has, you know, kind of gone like this. I think the war in Ukraine may help us, you know, because, you know, the Black Sea was also, you know, growing significantly with a huge potential to grow much further. At the same time, the concern going forward is climate change and so on. Will we be able to produce at the same level? And so, you know, Dave's comments about transformational R&D to deal with these big challenges and threats, you know, are we going to develop Northern Australia? Are we going to be able to handle a much hotter, drier climate? Are we really addressing those issues? And, you know, these are 10 to 20 year issues. You know, they're not 5-year issues, you know, like 10, 20, 30 years in the future. Are we still going to be able to produce? And are we thinking in that sort of time frame? Are we putting the money into those big questions? And, yeah, Dave, your comment about the long tail and so on, you know, perhaps preventing enough money being put in transformational research. I mean, the RD system is, you know, I think it's one of the greatest things ever done, but it's not. It has its issues, and one issue is, of course, it's a democratic choice of growers to tax themselves for R&D, and so they retain a fair bit of control over, you know, where the money goes. And being on one of those boards, we're reflecting very much on that, about how to deal with the transformational challenges as well as meeting the requirements of our investors who are the farmers, you know. So anyway, I'll stop talking there.
No, that's fine. Johanna.
Yeah, I just observe listening to people talk about the need for R&D in this field. It kind of goes to Tracy's point that this is actually a tech industry, in the sense that these are the same conversations that are happening in the tech industry in Australia, right? The issues of scale, the issues of flow over, the issues of how do you generate enough R&D investment so that we can drive Australian innovation in this field. These are all issues that are very much front of mind, and Kate Pounder, the head of the Tech Council of Australia, is grappling with. And so, you know, I think there is a lot of crossover in terms of the challenges, but also potentially the solutions, which is looking at those R&D investment cycles and how do you actually grow this sector within Australia. And I just to the point about the mining, do you have a mining tech industry and the hammer and the pick? My uncle is a geologist, and he often goes out in the very, very remote areas, helicoptered in with his pick, like literally with a pick. But he now does that with a pack full of extremely high-tech equipment that gets put down this bit and that bit and pulled out over here. And I think the model, or what you're trying to develop in this space, is having it so that you have the farmer doing not necessarily the same kit on his back, but having that same prevalence of technology to assist and to drive more efficient, better outcomes. And that comes back to R&D, which is a challenge in Australia more generally.
Well, let me put this, difficult question to you then. How much of that technology, and I know you can't actually quantify this, it's more of a rhetorical question, but how much of that technology in that kit is Australian developed technology, and does that actually matter? Which I suppose is another way of saying, do we need to grow the ag tech sector? It's almost like an understanding that we're all proceeding on the basis of that it is a good thing and needs to develop. But if ag tech is being developed elsewhere and able to be adapted here, is that sometimes a more efficient path? Is there sort of stereo invention of the wheel in some of these cases?
I think there's still a real prevalence of a not invented here technology in Australian R&D, where if it's not Australian, it's not developed. I'm making this up. If it's not developed by the CSIRO, it's no good. I'm sorry, just using that as an example. And I think that's dangerous. We've got to be open. Open innovation. What's the definition of open innovation? Your antennae are out there, and you're prospecting and sourcing for innovation and ideas from anywhere. I remember a few years ago, I was asked by UQ to assess. They developed some really great accelerated plant breeding technology, which there's 4 or now 3 wheat breeding companies in Australia. And I assessed it, and I said, you've got no presence, you're not well known, you don't have a strong IP position. Why don't you approach one of the other players and just do a deal? And that was my report. And
I'm sure that went down
they said, no, this is Australian. We're not going to sell our idea to a corporate. We want to develop this ourselves. And that's such a naive approach. And what do? They actually sold it to one of those 3 wheat breeding companies in Australia, which is what they should have done. They're making good royalty out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the other path was an extremely torturous one and expensive. Yeah. Sorry, Pip?
So, at Agrifutures Australia, we look after 13 very different levied industries, and so we find that we're not always going to have a technology or research or science solution that our market needs. So we do find that we import some technologies, but the really big challenge of not having your homegrown agri-tech market, and we do produce fabulous agri-tech in Australia, is that it's not built for Australian conditions, regulations or policies, and it is not easy to attract the leading global technologists into an Australian market where they have got a much smaller. Some of them won't even look at Australia. We've got to lure them over here with venture capital if they want to, come and play in our market. And so it is extremely important that we have our homegrown technologies from a farmer's perspective, because otherwise they actually might be, 10th for a company that's grown in, like Israel's not even scaling into Israel. They'll test in the US, then they go to Europe, and then they'll look where else that they need to go. And we don't want Australian farmers to be 6th, 7th on a to-market list for new technologies.
I think we also miss some opportunities. So when I think about technology, as I've talked about a lot of time, I think about exports. And one of the things that we do a lot of things is we might export, let's go back to pineapples. We export pineapples, not that we do, but we export pineapples to, let's say, Vietnam. Each country has their protocols of what they will and won't import and how they import it. So if I'm developing those protocols with them, they're probably developing them with 20 other countries at the same time. So if I have a piece of technology that we develop here that goes through all those checks and balances and comes up with a scanning system that can get the pineapple very quickly to Vietnam, well then I can suddenly also now sell that piece of technology from Vietnam back to Australia to check my work. I can also now suddenly sell it to 20 other countries because Vietnam's having the same conversation with someone else. So am I, saying that we can only have an Australian ag tech sector? No. Can we only have a non-Australian ag sector? No. But there are opportunities that aren't just building it for Australian farmers. Well, that's great. There are opportunities for us to have it as part of the global offer we have for the world. So I think by not developing a sector here, we're missing out on some really good opportunities.
Well, Tracy, I suppose we're about to go to questions, so I'll give you notice of that, and if anyone's got a question, signal to get the microphone. But just while we do that, Tracy, the last comment, the comment about the agricultural sector, you talked about a roadmap for the future. Why hasn't a roadmap been developed in the past? I know roadmaps are all the thing these days, but it's about having an understanding of the role of the sector in the future and what they call a glide path these days toward growth. What's been the hold up and what are the prospects for it now?
Well, I guess, it's part of that problem I mentioned earlier of just being really focused on, on the agricultural perspective and lens over ag innovation, rather than seeing it as a tech sector and starting to build out, all the risks that Johanna was mentioning, which exist in the tech sector and you have to address, including skill shortages, training people up to be ready to build and accelerate an agri-tech sector. The baseline analysis of the sector has to be done before we have a roadmap, and I think there's a lack of understanding of how important it is, and also whose job it is to do it, which is why the Agritech Association will be doing that piece of work. Is it the digitalisation, Office of Digitalisation, or is it agriculture that has to do that work, and who pays? So yes, at the moment it's sitting with the Agritech Association.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the audience? We do. We have one just here in the middle. If you could just say your name and organisation and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Thanks to the panel. I'm Michael Wellington, PhD student at ANU, supported by CEAT. Despite the comments about agriculture being a tech sector, I'm wondering if we're ultimately talking about a human resources challenge because the issues that Christine raised with supply chains were caused by labour market disruptions, and even in our industries that lead the world in terms of output per labour unit, like our broadacre grains industry, we had scenarios where airline pilots were driving chaser bins, headers, etc. And perhaps arguably supporting Dave's sentiments about short-termism and long tails, the industry lobby groups asked for more people, not more technology or better technology, and they successfully lobbied for changes to ag working visas, etc. So I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on whether the current labour market environment helps or hinders technological innovation and how we transition to an ag workforce that's more sustainable, skilled and more technologically focused.
It's a really fascinating question. Who would like to take that? Tracy?
A couple of comments to that. So with it being a tech sector and the workforce issues, it's right across tech, and probably Johanna would echo that. And that is something that the Tech Council's working on, and the AIIA, and if you go to any of their sites, they talk about it all the time. But it's really the issue around getting traction within the Australian government and really getting a lot more focus on building all our tech sectors here in Australia, the funding to do that, and then also the willingness to start to, transform our industries and start applying these technologies. It's expensive and it's complicated. And there is the digitalisation agenda, and I haven't had a close look at that. Johanna might know more about it, but it's digitalisation of Australia absolutely must happen. There's a target by 2030, and I just hope we get there. A practical example I can give you of agriculture and technology and the regions being interested is one of my discussions with a mayor up in North Queensland. Super keen to talk about Agritech, really keen to find another industry that their young people might stay in town for. What can I use my TAFE for? Can I run a boot camp on coding? Can we start to understand blockchain and provenance and how all these sorts of things work? they're looking for this. We haven't got it into our schools yet. We see little 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds building robots, doing robotics. But I guess it's the people in this room in our generation, you had to enrol in the course if you wanted to do it. But I think in rural and regional Australia, it has to start to be I code in agriculture. And I think we need to start to get that message out there.
It's something that kids and, we always talk about the fact that the next generation is leaving the farm, right? Well, if you can inspire a generation of either current children or people who have left and want to come back to say, actually, there are these really interesting applications for technology that can increase the productivity, that can help drive a new industry in Australia or to renew the agricultural industry in Australia. That's exciting, right? People want to get involved in that. And so being able to harness that and create that as an opportunity and to sell it to the next generation as an opportunity, I think is something that we need to do, in addition to then being able to provide the resources to fill that skills gap.
And you may end up with, not having a crook back by the time you're about 45.
Can I just add? Yes. I think what you're talking about is a cultural journey. And the cultural journey in our approach to innovation, it's a cultural journey in our approach to how we treat our workforce. It's a cultural journey in saying, okay, you don't have to have gone to Timbuktu Downs as a jackaroo or jillaroo to work in agriculture. So it's a cultural journey from where we are now, which is risk aversion, funding dependence, conservative nature, where it's not okay to fail. And I'd say that we need to learn to fail safe before we can fail fast. And in this country, you're not allowed to fail. You can't fail. You can't fail with R&D funds in this country. So we need to move from that position to one that's more internationally engaged and entrepreneurial. So it's a cultural journey, and it's going to take a while.
But you'll be pleased to know ANUCAD is actually doing a very big piece of work on agricultural workforce, including tech developer shortages and on-farm and supply chain shortages, which I'm looking forward to reading myself.
I'd be really fascinated to know whether there is any anecdotal evidence, perhaps all it would be at this stage, about the enthusiasm for technological solutions as a result of the last 2 years of that labour market shortage. I don't know, does anyone have any intel on that?
Yeah, there is a lot. Sorry, did you want to take that?
No, just go ahead. I want to add something else. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with COVID, supply chains, our seasonal workforce not being available, there has been a flurry of, agricultural producers wanting to know where they can get things like automation. There's been a lot of shared investment across farms to bring in, picking platforms, centralised packing warehouses. And there's also been a flurry of people creating apps and solutions to be able to address or make our current system more efficient so we can move the workforce around in a more efficient way that suits, things like harvest, picking, vintage.
Thanks, Pip. Richard?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add the other final element of the people puzzle is, that we can attract the best and brightest, to do our research of the future. So congratulations for choosing agriculture as, as your industry of choice. And we need, way more, of our best young minds to address these really big challenges we're facing.
Yes, do we have another question? We've got a couple here. Owen, by the look.
Oh, sorry, you could hold that. Yes. Look, we've heard some wonderful different perspectives and so on. I want to, 30 years away, the climate's really different. Geopolitically, well, it changed on February 24th and it's probably going to be very different again in 30 years' time. And consumer choice will have changed and so on around the planet. Do we have the right innovation ecosystem in all its facets to deliver the tools that our farmers would need in 30 years' time to grow plants, be primary producers, produce animals in a way that's sustainable and profitable? Is incremental change that's coming through our existing ecosystem going to be enough to get there? And if not, what else do you do?
It's a really tough question, that one, because it touches on the whole food question as well.
I think we've got the tools. I think we understand what the issues are. I think we're far more forward-looking, but there's a hesitancy and a lack of courage to actually take a step. I don't think we have a framework. We don't have. I'm purposely not using the word ecosystem because it drives me nuts. So I've just said it. I'm sorry. But we don't have a system in Australia, an agri-innovation system in Australia. We have an ad hoc system that sort of works. No, it doesn't work. And so until we get that right, I don't think we'll be able to address those issues properly.
I mean, it strikes me there's you've used the term a little while ago, sort of a cultural barrier, I suppose, to get through with some of these things. If we think about, we're constantly told that with the population of the world growing and with the effects of climate change and other forces, that the challenge to feed the population is immense. It strikes me that, agriculture is always accepted as the answer, but it's the failing answer absent the technology and the technological advances that need to occur. That's really the core of the issue, isn't it? So that the communications task that the sector, for example, as you describe it, Tracy, needs the challenge it needs to square up to, I think, is in getting governments, getting investors to understand that critical role in taking an agricultural sector that has performed in a certain way under these circumstances and is going to have to face all of those different challenges that Owen referred to.
Absolutely. Certainly when we were talking earlier about what is the issue around investment, and it is the long lead times in getting a product to market and testing it, and the issues with only being able to test a product a certain number of weeks a year, and the size of our market as well in terms of the return you're going to get. If you were going to invest in an Australian Agritech, you would be hoping that they were going to be heading overseas. The Australia is perfect for testing Agritech if you move it around and get the different climates and all the different environments that you want to test it in. But yeah, look, certainly from our point of view, there definitely are challenges. We think we need to accelerate, and I've been really clear in the election statement about what needs to happen to accelerate the ecosystem, and we just really hope that there is the appetite to do that. And certainly the question we had earlier raised the issue of digitalisation. I mean, that's another portfolio again. So starting to get this collaboration, and we do see countries like Israel who have a dedicated innovation approach right across their economy, which is, bipartisan in terms of how they approach it. They can accelerate, and they've done a really great job. Same with New Zealand. Yeah.
Bipartisan, I remember that.
Oh, and your question is, what about if we looked at chose the sector or chose agriculture broadly? What are the winners? We spend too much time investing in a whole range of stuff, trying to appease a whole lot of interest groups and self-interest groups. What are the investment winners that we need to invest in now? Because that's what the private sector's doing. That's their bread and butter. They don't invest in stuff that's not going to give them a return. So what are the key winners from a research perspective that we need to invest in that are going to give us what we want in 30 years' time? And I don't think we're doing that because our system won't allow us to.
Yeah, Johanna.
I think, so actually very much on the same vein. For me, if you're talking 30 years in advance, what do we need to do now to make sure we're in a good position in 30 years? We have to be able to very clearly state what does Australia do best in the agritech industry? And if you can't answer that question, then we've got a problem, and that would be the first thing we need to do, right? Where is Australia's competitive advantage? Not just because we have the tech industry to support it, but also because climate change. Surely Australia, it occurs to me that Australia would be learning some lessons on that before others are, that we can turn into a competitive advantage for us in the Agritech environment, and that was touched on here. So what do we do best? But then also, how do we encourage importation and absorption for those areas of Agritech where maybe we're not going to be leaders, but we're going to be takers of that technology, and we need to encourage others to take it up. And be really pragmatic about the fact we're not going to actually design all of that tech, but we'll bring some of it in. And then to the point, I think it was Pip who was talking about John Deere tractors and how do you fix the tractor, and encouraging farmers to take that up. Well, maybe from a policy perspective, when we're importing that tech, we are looking at saying, well, look, we need right to repair built in. You know, this is actually a very live discussion in the tech sector. Why can't I pull my iPhone to pieces and fix it if I want to? Why can't I pull my John Deere tractor to pieces if I want to fix it? And making sure that that is built into the technology that we're importing it. And that also goes to the geopolitical instability, so that if we find ourselves in 30 years suddenly cut off by a geopolitical shock, that we actually still have the independence, notwithstanding the fact that maybe more than 50% of our agritech comes from overseas.
Do we have a... yes. Sorry, I'll come to you straight next, okay, after.
Yeah, hi, I've enjoyed the conversations though, particularly David's very pragmatic discussion about the realities of the commercial world, and that's kind of where I want to direct some of the discussion, because I've sort of looked back at some of the technologies I've been dealing with the last few years, and Australia's a small market. Less than 50% of the Australian producers are unviable. The top 20% of the producers is actually where the market exists. They're the larger corporates these days. And so when we're pragmatically looking through an investment lens, we're actually looking to basically who can afford the technology is the best way to describe it. And the challenge I've sort of seen as we've wanted to bring some technologies to market is that it's actually quite difficult to encourage some of the overseas technologies to even consider the Australian market. We're just so small. And so there's some challenges there to remain internationally competitive. Not only do we have to adapt technologies within Australia, but we actually have to ensure that we get access to the technologies our competitors getting overseas to. And if I look at the John Deere 8R series autonomous tractor, which has just been released, and I've worked with industry, actually with John Deere and CNH and Agco and others on a national code of practice on machine autonomy here in this country. But the challenge is that if we actually had not been pragmatic and actually developed that, John Deere just wouldn't be interested in bringing the technology here. So we've actually had to look at ways that we can actually draw it here. So I'd like to throw the conversation to how can we ensure that Australia remains internationally competitive and we get access to the technology that's been developed overseas?
I'll have a go at that.
Okay, away you go.
So, well, Johanna, you mentioned about what we're best at. I think we really need to define where we do have critical leadership, and by having a single-minded focus and working on those areas, we build IP that then can be, it's an asset we can trade. Let's say we're leading in dry land agriculture. Well, that's something somehow we can work with John Deere to build, to fit into their machines or something like that, so that you can actually have something to attract them and also potentially be the part of global, activities that are working in that space. You'll never solve the whole problem, but I think by really working on the areas that we're very, very strong at, you create assets that can be traded, that can be part of global initiatives. So that's on the IP side. I mean, the investment side as well. I'm going to switch here to Dave, and your comment about early on in your opening statements about some different funding models. I'm interested to hear more about moving on, because we have a significant pool of funds. It is they are grower funds. We can adapt, but there will be limits.
There's taxpayer funds in there too.
There is taxpayer funds. I agree, and that there could be work on that. But what was your comment about alternative ways of funding R&D going forward?
I think someone said to me once, in life and in business, you've got to make yourself easy to love. And I think in business, before I go there, Richard, we've got to make ourselves easy to love in Australia. If we want to attract the John Deeres of the world and those big players, the standard RDC contract has 27 clauses and 157 sub-clauses. I know that because I spent a decade dealing with it. And it has a number of onerous reporting clauses about warranty, downstream liability, ownership. And I remember having a conversation. I was at Davis University for a couple of days a few years ago. And there was, if you've ever been there, it's an amazing place. And the first day's conversation went really well, and I left them the contract overnight. I came back in the morning and they started laughing. They just sort of threw it back in my face. And then I went down the road to Riverside campus, you know, the poor cousin of Davis, and they did the same thing. So what I'm saying is we get so focused on IP and royalty flow, and it's not such a big deal. Let's have a fit-for-purpose term sheet where we can engage on the key things, because it's a real barrier to entry. We have our approach to commercialisation and our IP, they just don't match. They're counterintuitive. So we're not going to make ourselves easy to love. And I think we can learn a bit from that. Sorry, Richard?
The funding, you were talking about institutes, you know, becoming funders.
It's interesting. You deal with the group of eights and CSIROs of the world. And something I found towards the end of my time at Hort with the new funding model was what I call the poorer cousin universities, with great respect, that the non-GO8 universities, who really, they know their position, but they're far more open to engaging with you and doing things in a novel way. And I'm talking about Macquarie University, I'm talking about Western Sydney University, where I was able to get substantial funds, many millions of dollars from those folks around a shared purpose, a couple of shared purpose ideas that I wouldn't have got from a GO8 or CSIRO. Well, CSIRO, they're not a funder, they're a provider of research. So I think it's picking your target and prospecting. The world of agricultural research is a big place, Richard, and I think sometimes we fool ourselves in knowing that we know everything and we don't. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. But isn't there always a problem with talking? I mean, we're getting very close to time, so I'll just throw this in. Isn't the problem, in a sense, that we're talking about a sector as if it's a single entity? But as you said in your opening comments, you know, the money follows. You've got to follow the money flow, or as we say that in journalism, follow the money, and that'll tell you the story. And money will go to where there is a return on that investment, where it's you know, the chance of that return is as high as possible, and the return is as high as possible. And that's really what's governing a lot of the innovation investment in the sector. So to talk about it as a single entity is, or at least it can be misleading.
So I think for me that's where I have a different but the same opinion today. So when I look at what the future of funding is for ag, I don't look at us trying to work out what our problem is and saying, you know, let's look at different types of ways to fund it. I go and look at what everyone's funding. So if you go and look at Ag Funder, which is the big conglomerate in the US of all the different types of, you know, third-party funding that happens, they will tell you that right now in agriculture, 90% of their funding is going to food. Food systems, food security, food management. And we just spent a lot of time talking about agriculture, which is great, but we haven't spent a lot of time talking about food. So my answer to that is we actually need to start pivoting from, yes, we have this problem, or we're trying to get farms to be more productive, or we're trying to do more things. But are we really talking about the end result, which is we're producing food? And how are we trying to partner with someone who's putting, say, in last month, about $4.5 trillion into food in the US? Well, how are we talking to those people saying, so what are you funding? And can I piggyback on that? If you're building it for, you know, Costco in the US, well, there's a Costco here. If you're building, you know, cukes or a classic, you know, the cute little cucumbers you grow in hothouses here, they're predominantly grown in a hothouse. How are we saying to them, hey, have you thought about this? Where are we putting mangoes into different types of partnerships, and not through a technical lens, but through a market lens, through a market access lens, through a lens that says, you are trying to sell this food product and I'm trying to do something different.
Yes, interesting point. Should we take one last question?
Can
Yes.
Extend the analogy that was made about we should all make yourself easy to love. I think to extend that also, it's about finding friends and sometimes picking fights, right? And when I say finding friends, I mean, with the John Deere example, maybe fighting John Deere on the right to repair is not something Australia can do by ourselves, but maybe we can if we band together with, the other smaller players in this field. And then when I say pick your fights, it's about having someone who has that oversight view to say, actually, this is the fight that the Agritech Association is going to pick. We're going to band together with the industry associations in India, in insert other markets, and this is something that is worth fighting for Australia because it's important for our long-term future. So I take the point that maybe right to repair and John Deere is a difficult one, but it may be sometimes that we do need to have those difficult fights, and it's being able to identify those ones that we do need to.
I think we've gone to the days where we can be everything to everyone because we've got a finite pool of funds. The role of government is changing all the time, so we need to be smarter, and we can't fund everything a little bit. Let's focus on, as I've said, the investment winners, the research winners that are going to make a huge difference to agriculture and food in this country. And until we start doing that, we're just going to keep driving that Datsun 180B. That's what the model we have is at the moment, a Datsun 180B. It gets you from A to B. But wouldn't we rather be driving a more modern car?
We don't build cars in this country anymore, by the way. Final question here, because I think we're very close to time.
SIAT. What I've been interested in is that we're talking about agriculture, but I don't think there's a singular definition of agriculture, and certainly we're caught up with a different food agricultural future when you look at things we haven't been talking about, like cellular production and a whole lot of other things, other forms of food that don't just come off a cat, an animal or from a vegetable in the ground. And we're also missing your point, David. If we've got to agree on some particular priorities going forward about what we will invest in, we've got to have a vision or a view of what agriculture is going to look like, what success in agriculture is going to look like. Yeah, and we don't have that. Yeah, and so for me, some of the things that we've been looking at, which is the intergenerational challenges, are not just about intergenerational challenges. They're about our cultural myths about agriculture as well. About people in the bush, people on the land. The idea that if we have autonomous tractors, there'll be no reason for kids or families to be staying there, and there'll be winners and losers, and we'll end up with great agricultural corporations and conglomerations, when in fact that's not going to be the future. It's diversifying, and the money's going to all of these new forms of food that don't just come from the land and from the animal. So I'm just wondering why we aren't incorporating and trying to synthesise a more sophisticated vision of ag going forward, which obviously relies on tech, because everything we're doing relies on tech these days to go to the next place.
Oh, look, I agree. I think actually did a recent bit of study. I analysed $1 billion worth of research over 18 years in horticulture, and in part of that, I think there was 15 independent reviews which have actually just said what you've said, and they're orphans. They're all orphans. They're all sitting on a shelf, gathering dust, and so why, I don't know. A lack of leadership. And that's why I'm suggesting, I think the status quo is broken, and Richard, we need to go around it. Sometimes when you've got an obstacle, you just got to go around it.
Okay. Let's go around. I think the point is it's pretty clear. I mean, we need to increase food production by 60%, and I think agriculture already uses 80% of the world's water. So we're going to it's going to have to be a whole range of technologies. The vertical farming in cities. It's going to have to be factory-made foods. And they will all be different slices, and we're going to have to increase our production per hectare as well. So it will be a very different kind of vision going forward. Defining what exactly that is and what part Australia plays in each of those, that's a big task. But in a lot of ways, maybe the market will sort it out. But whatever it is, I mean, we need to have a very forward-looking focus on, a very diverse agriculture for the future.
If the market will sort it out, we're going to go to a final question in a second, one more final question. But if the market will sort it out, what's the reason the market's not sorting it out at the moment? Is it that there is a distortion in the market, which is the very mechanisms you talk about? It is the CDCs or whatever you call them, RDCs, sorry.
I think that's partly it. I think, as the current Minister for Agriculture said, sometimes the government just needs to get the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
But part of the issue is, and it sort of relates to what we're talking about Agtech, there's a distinction. A fellow in the US told me many years ago, he said, you need to distinguish between what is a gap in the market and is there a market in that gap. Now, I'm not being contrary, but sometimes there will be gaps in the market and there will always be gaps in the market. But work out, is there a market in that gap, and you're on a winner. And I don't think we have the thought leadership yet to do that.
I think that's probably what Tracy's about to do for us, and I'm sure will also help us to get around some of these roadblocks as well. So I'd love to hear from you.
Look, I mean, I certainly, the association will just work on these problems, regardless of what government is doing, regardless of, any issues with the RDCs. It is its own market, and if they need to grow their businesses, they'll do what they need to do that. I think the survey of the ecosystem is a really good example. We're just going to do that survey. Our members will help us to do it. And in terms of driving collaboration between research institutions and corporates and really working on commercialisation, we can work on that as well. So that's certainly in our program to try to achieve all those things. We'll talk to the various stakeholders if we have to, otherwise we're just going to get on with the job.
It strikes me as rather curious that we're sitting here at the sort of about the 9-year mark of a government whose Deputy Prime Minister represents the agricultural party, the Farmers' Party by reputation, and yet, I mean, that's a sort of a political overlay that I won't expect anyone here to necessarily comment on, but it is surprising that we can have a situation like that where that level of political influence at the very top of the government has perhaps not been, the word leadership's been mentioned a few times, has perhaps not been very prominent, and we obviously can see that most critically in respect of climate change because of the resistance that there has been within the political machine, if I can put it that way. One final question after my little editorial there.
Hi, Anita Pearson, Institute for Water Futures, and also in collaboration with SEAT. It just strikes me, just listening to you in a very interesting panel discussion and questions from the audience, is that we're not looking at the broader food system and what that actually is and what that looks like. And in fact, agri-technology is only one small part of the entire food system. And it's actually also been a subject of considerable concern and discussion right around the world, not only because of the pandemic in the last 2 years. I'm from Victoria and have experienced the lockdowns and the consequences for communities and sectors in a very diverse way. But also in terms of, we've had the new UN Food System Summit in September last year, and I participated in various dialogues around the world and also in Australia. And there's a lot of the thinking and the knowledge is already existing. And it's also existing outside of the agri-technology sector. It's within different population groups across the world who have a vested interest in the food system. Now, we are unfortunate in Australia that we don't have a national policy or even at state or territory level. And we've got local governments around the country with or without a food system policy. And so some of them are approaching them in forward-looking ways. For instance, City of Greater Bendigo, Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, but others are, with their hands tied, unable to do so because of legislation restrictions or because they have absolutely no interest. Or if they switch to a climate change mitigation adaptation plans, food system issues are mostly looking at community gardens. And there's a loss of focus of what a food system could look like at a local, regional or city region level. So agri-technology, yes, I believe and agree that it has a role to play, but within the broader food system itself, not just that it's an entity in its own. Thank you.
Interesting point. Anyone like to respond to that?
So I think for me, I don't know anyone else, but I'm a terrible gardener. I can barely grow a chili plant, let alone anything else. And if you've ever tried to grow enough to sustain yourself, it's actually quite difficult. And anyone who's tried that is really quite challenging. So agriculture is part of that food supply. It's part of the broader conversation about food, because we don't just produce the good for the sake of it. We produce it for someone or to do something or to have an input. But is food security, is food as a concept really important? Yes. And sometimes do I think in agriculture we talk about enough? No, I don't think we do. If I go and meet a producer, I'm like, oh, hi Dave, how are you? I'm Christine, I'm from the government. Please don't hit me. And what do you produce? But that really shouldn't be the question I ask Dave. Who do you grow it for, Dave? What part of the supply chain you're in? How do you meet your customers' needs? That's a really confronting question for producers, because they're used to producing what they produce. But if we don't start talking about it in a different way, which is, hi Dave, I'm Christine, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you solve your problems. And by the way, who are you producing for and which part of the supply chain you're in? That becomes a different mindset. And so that is where food becomes the end point. And Agritech then is part of that story. How does Dave, as the person I'm talking about, who he's producing for, have an input that helps him either get it to that person, discuss it with that person, or get the right product for that person?
I guess there's challenges in the food system and opportunities in the creation or the growing of food that are being met in all kinds of different ways, some of which are very much a function of technological advances, whether it be in the crops that the seeds that they can get hold of to grow, or whether it be in other elements of the other developments, technological developments in how food can be grown in cities and in small allotments, and using artificial light and a range of other things. These things are all intertwined, but I take your point. It's in a sense, it's the primary question, really. It's all about food production, and we all care about that, and we need to always remember that. Any final comment from anyone on that subject?
I would just say it's a semantics, and I do a lot of writing on the subject, and I find myself flitting between agri-tech, agri-food tech, and agri-food innovation. And I would say from this conversation, I would hope that a lot of us are talking about food technologies and food innovation, as well as digital technologies and, on-farm agri-tech. And I think, Denise, it comes back to your question around, are we looking at that broad spectrum? And I do think whether it's synthetic biologies in our food systems, or how people are, thinking about how we're growing and connecting people to food, that actually all falls under our, this conversation of the future of ag innovation.
Thank you very much for those comments, and it's clear that we've covered quite a lot of territory here today, and a lot of it is quite difficult terrain in a sense, because there are problems with definition, there are problems with how we understand what the challenges are, and the outer boundaries of that, really, the extent to which we can control some of these things domestically. We're obviously subject to international forces of capital investment, and of course weather, a critical factor in all of this. But I think we've really added a lot of value here, and I hope, Owen, that we've given you much food for thought in terms of your own strategic planning about how to frame the challenge going forward. There's been some great ideas with right to repair, for example, with agricultural technology, and there's some strong and I think very valid observations about essentially a broken funding model, or some contradictions that exist within the funding model. There are challenges associated with both viewing the ag tech sector as a sector, but also understanding that investors and end users of technology will make their own decisions and are largely, in some ways, disaggregated from others. So it's an area rich with opportunities and challenges. I hope we've explored some of those today. And can I ask you to put your hands together for our fantastic panel?